Hey, deserving listeners, 90 Day Fiancé. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. As I always say, don't use YouTube as a replacement for therapy. If you need a therapist, get one. You deserve it. You really do. Let's watch.
I paid for this car. I paid for all this. Michael didn't pay for that. Michael's done it. He's really got me questioning if he's scamming me. So I gave Michael one last chance to take down that damn Instagram, and he had the nerve to text me, LOL, no. Michael! At the wrong... Get out of here! Your car's being destroyed! Put that in your purse.
Okay, hard to know what she is meaning by that, but one way of looking at when she says you mess with the wrong American, does that mean that this is some kind of racist-based attack of some sort? Like, I don't know. I mean, just who knows what... I mean, one of the things that I will sometimes mention, but I forget often, is that when you just poll the general population of Americans, there are some very weird echo chambers existing in my country. People who believe literally, like a sizable percentage, 5-10% of Americans, I can't remember the last poll, that believe that essentially believe in QAnon and all the things that entails. For example, that Hillary Clinton and Tom Hanks and all those other elites are literally reptile people who sacrifice children and drink their blood so that they can live forever, that kind of thing. I mean, literally, there are people who believe that's nonsense. And you're just like, huh? I mean, those kinds of conspiracy theories were always out there, but huge chunks of the United States. And so undoubtedly, some of the people on this show have been at least of that sort, or in those weird echo chambers that have extremely weird points of view. And it's not like American exceptionalism or racism or bigotry is a weird point of view in the United States, or really anywhere for that matter. So this idea that when push comes to shove, that Angela might actually feel superior because she's a white American from Florida, if she did believe that, that wouldn't be such a stretch of the imagination, right? Really. But somehow when I watch this show, I don't think about that. I don't imagine that to be true. But of course that could be true. I mean, just imagine the amount of weird messages that some of the people on the show could have ingested over the years. And when they're interacting with someone from another country, particularly a black or brown person, the attitudes that will come out of them. And I will say that abuse often is fueled by such attitudes, whether it's racism or obviously sexism, misogyny, or some other ism. There's usually a component there that needs to be deprogrammed. Essentially, it's not like every person who has significant racist attitudes or significant sexist attitudes is abusive, but when you have those attitudes and you also have a propensity and a model, you were modeled that kind of behavior growing up, you're much more likely to commit those acts because not only do you think it's normal to be abusive, but you also think you're entitled from a number of different angles, including based on your identity. So I don't know if that's what's going on. Let's rewind that.
Michael! At the wrong... Get out of here! Your car's being destroyed! Put that in your purse.
I mean, just who knows what's really happening right here, but that attitude is not foreign to me, so to speak. That attitude that an American would say, you can't mess with me. I can do anything to you. I have all the privilege. I can invade your space. I can hit you. I can tear your stuff apart. I gave you everything. My economic power is, it's basically a microcosm of Reaganism, what she's doing right now. I mean, literally invading Africa and saying you mess with the wrong American. It's not quite a stretch to imagine that she would have those kinds of attitudes, really. But I don't want to accuse her of everything. There hasn't been any direct statements around that. And then often I do wonder on this show about the cast members, the Americans, and their attitude, because it would be tempting to look at the white Americans on the show and say, like, well, they can't be that racist because look who they want to marry. But sometimes that is not true. That doesn't correlate. In fact, it can be the opposite, where the more racist you are, the more stereotyping you will do of people who don't live in your culture, people of other cultures, and thus you will believe that you will believe in things that will lead you to believe that you will actually have power over that person, or they will depend on you, or whatever, or that you are more special, or whatever. And of course, that could play a role in one's decision to date someone. So, because one of the things that people will say when they're accused of being a racist, they'll be like, well, my partner is a person of color, so I can't be racist. And you're just like, no. I mean, maybe, absolutely, but not necessarily. And I will say that everyone, including myself, has racist attitudes. We can't get out of it. We've been indoctrinated into a system that supports all sorts of nonsense and propaganda, and you can't get away from that. Even if from an early age you were told that everyone was equal, the bulldozing nature of our culture just rolls over everyone's minds, if I'm using this metaphor. And so it's not a matter of if you're a racist, it's how you are dealing with your indoctrination into racist attitudes.
It's the middle of the night, and I'm tired, but I'm really exhausted from Michael's constant disrespect. I'm knocking on his door, I'm calling his name, and he won't even come out the damn house.
Yeah, I said this last time, that if the genders were reversed, it would be much more clear to us, because we have many more examples of that, where a man is being hostile and aggressive and abusive to a woman. But of course, we know that that can happen regardless of the gender configuration. So when a man comes up to a house and starts tearing apart the car and yelling and screaming and pounding on the door, and you better get out here, and of course, you should not leave the house. There would be no reason to do that. She's intoxicated. She has an ally with her. She believes that Angela believes she has a legal right to do whatever she wants to you and your property. I mean, she thinks she has a legal right to do that. The other thing that you just wonder is, what if the police were called? Sometimes in other countries, the police don't play games. You know what I mean? They'll just haul you away and put you away for years for small charges. I don't know if that's the case where Michael lives, but I don't know. It just seems like a risk you don't want to take. Of course, he should not come out. I said this last time. He should not come out. Not only to protect himself, but to protect Angela to some extent, because if he comes out, she's going to do something and it's not going to be good. So yeah, it's just absurd.
Did you know how that makes me feel as his wife? I'm not just coming across the damn streets. I have flew across the world.
So we use this as a jumping off point. This is a possible example of how when we are trying to avoid something through our various defenses, we will create the circumstances upon which we will actually experience what we're trying to avoid. I think she's trying to avoid two things: humiliation and rejection. And so in her mind, by doing all this, which we clearly see, I don't have to summarize it, she thinks she's actually avoiding rejection and humiliation, but she's actually creating it. She's creating the circumstances upon which rejection and humiliation will automatically happen. And the more busted up about it, the more of a complex we have the less insight we have it, the less healing we've had about it, the less therapy we've had about it, then the more severe our defenses will be, and thus the more severe our recreation of the circumstances upon which we will re-experience these things. And then we feel more rejection, more humiliation, more need for defenses, more need to recreate it, more recreations, more traumas. It just goes round and round and round.
You want to break up? Then you divorce me. This is my car. Y'all bitch and raise hell, because I'm not going to kiss his ass when he sit there and stab me in the goddamn heart. Michael really is not who he presents himself to be. I've never hid who I am. I'm a fighter. I'll be a fighter till the day I die.
Yeah. So again, I can't know what's really happening here. I'd have to assess the situation, but that is a very common thing that abusive people will say. Look, this is who I am. You married me. I've never hid that from you. And if you're the victim, you're just like, well, so that means it's okay? I was never okay with it. And you didn't really exhibit this in the first bit of our relationship. So you weren't really like that from the beginning. And if I knew this, I probably wouldn't have ever dated you. But now that we're entangled. And I also think that that's because she probably does on the inside have a voice telling her that she's doing something wrong, that she does have some guilt and or shame around what she's doing, at least in that latter portion. She's already done whatever she's done. They're talking with her away from the house, I think, and she's saying, look, I've always been this way. I've always, he knew who he was getting involved with. I've always been a fighter. I think because that's in response to her own internal voice of, what are you doing? Like, knock it off. Often abusive people will have that voice. And when I'm working with them, I want to get into that dialectic with them. I want them to express both sides because, and this is a tip for you therapists out there, and I'm sure you know this, but it's tempting when you're talking with an Angela to try to propose things that are really quite obvious, basically all the things that I've been saying and what everyone is saying. So it's obvious to anyone, and it's probably obvious to a part of her. And so when you exhibit that and you embody that part of the argument, that side of the argument, then it takes away an opportunity from her to be able to embody it. Because systems and emotional systems and human systems, we tend to take on roles. When someone presents one point, the other person feels compelled to bring up the opposing point or a different point. Whereas if one person brings up one point, and just to break it down in a very simple model, say there are 2 points to an issue. Angela is abusive or Angela is not abusive, for example. Two people walk into a room and they've never talked about that issue before. And whatever side the first person brings up, the other person will feel compelled to bring up the other side. Experiments actually show this. So if 2 people enter a room and one person says, Angela is abusive, the other person will feel compelled on some level to say, well, they'll want to give some caveat to it or even just say, no, she's not abusive. It's hard to imagine someone saying that, but they might say something like, well, she's had a tough life or something like that. Whereas if the first person comes in and says, I know she's being abusive, but she's really had a tough life, then the second person will feel compelled, on average, there's a lot of factors that play into human behavior, but this is one of the factors that play into human behavior, is the second person will be like, well, but no, she's really abusive. So when you are working with someone, I suppose if you're just having a partner or a friend like this, if you embody the level-headed side of the argument, the Angelas of the world, in all likelihood, will not ever even identify that they have those thoughts in the inside. Whereas if you don't take that side on, and it's a balance, right? So, for example, if I were talking with Angela and she were telling me about this situation, and in my head I'm like, wow, that's abusive. And I know from experience that if I present that, she will argue with me and she will oppose me and we will get nowhere. So I might say something like, well, I don't know what to think about it. It sounds like a really chaotic situation. Sounds like no one got what they really wanted. What do you think about it? When you reflect back, and now that you have some time to think about it, what do you think about everything that happened? Well, she'd probably start with a lot of stuff about Michael. Michael this, Michael that. And she'd probably still be in that mindset of like justifying herself. And I would let that all play itself out, because if you really let that breathe and finish itself, often, and that can take a long time, often at the end I'd be like, okay, I can see a lot of those points. I can see how I might try to identify something within that narrative that I could say was reasonable or at least validate her in terms of her feelings. When you do that fully, in therapy anyway, eventually the person will feel safe enough, like, okay, I feel validated, I feel okay, I feel accepted, now I can relax. What else is going on inside my head? And that's often when that other side will come out, and they might say something like, having said all that, sometimes I wonder if I went too far. And then as a therapist, you don't want to be like, haha, see, I knew it, because then they'll turtle back. So you want to be like, oh, interesting, tell me more or something. And it's important to do that as I learned this working mainly with teenagers, and she exhibits kind of in that zone of lack of awareness and stubbornness. But I learned that working with teenagers, in that if you jump on things, they will retreat because it's too vulnerable. It's too hard for them to accept. So you want to come across like you're interested and you're validating, but you don't have an agenda. You're not like, yeah, tell me more about that. That's the good place. All that other stuff was trash and crap. Now we're in the good part of your narrative. because they'll retreat. So you just want to be like, okay, tell me more. And some of you might actually have kids or students or something where you might talk this way with them as well. So it's a delicate balance, of course, and sometimes you want to do something else. And of course, you don't want to come across like you're being manipulative. And you don't want to, in your heart, feel like you're being manipulative because it doesn't feel very good. So I would often just try to adopt a listening stance and try not to think about, like, for example, with Angela type clients, which I don't usually have very often, but when I would, and I would have a lot more of them in my early career, I would try to convince them of things and get them to realize, whenever as a therapist you're like, I'm trying to get them to do this something, you've gone completely off the rails, because if you're trying to get a client to do something, so many things are wrong with what's happening in the therapy and your own perspective and approach. But anyway, I would be in that mindset and I'd struggle, and we'd do that A-B thing. And then eventually over the years, I'm like, you know what? As soon as I run into any kind of stubbornness, I need to just forego any kind of goal along these lines. I need to just be like, I'm going to sit with them, because the more I'm genuinely just sitting with them, the less of a vibe I'm going to come across like I have an agenda, and thus that other voice, that more rational, differentiated voice, will get a chance to come forward and feel safe enough to do so. And by the way, I'm sure there's some way of using this in sales techniques, some manipulative technique to get a customer to actually buy your product. Like you come out of the gate as a salesperson, you say like, you don't really want this. And then the other person says, yes. So it's sort of reverse psychology is kind of in that category. Again, it doesn't always work, but it is an interesting part of human relationships and motivation and systems. We like to think of ourselves as individuals, like we make our own choices, but a lot of one's opinions, or at least the opinions you take on, have to do with the emotional system that you're in.
But that's not mean that I'm not hurt.
Michael, she ruins your whole...
Yeah, so I've been down this road before, that she will cry and she will say that she's hurt. And yeah, I absolutely have compassion for that. But when you continue over the span of years to be abusive, then it's hard to have a lot of sympathy for that, right? It's hard to look at Angela and be like, oh, you poor thing. It's more like, well, you did this to yourself. Like, stop it. There's so many other ways to do what you're doing. So if you're hurt, you're just doing it to yourself. You're stabbing yourself in the thigh with a knife and you're crying and saying, my thigh hurts. Well, stop stabbing yourself in the thigh. This is all your fault. This whole scenario is your fault.
whole car.
Y'all want to sit here and let him do this to me?
I can probably
Got the
calm her
wrong
down for
goddamn
you.
American. Got the wrong mother.
She's
There it is again. Mess with the wrong. What is that supposed to mean? The wrong American. You messed with the wrong American. What does that mean? Is she saying that to give her license? It kind of sounds like that, right? It sounds like I'm an American, because you'll hear that. You'll hear Americans will travel to other countries and be like, I'm an American and I deserve things. Just like, what the F? Like, if anything, you deserve less because you're part of a colonializing imperialist nation that has taken from the world in a variety of ways. I mean, let alone the amount of greenhouse gases per capita that Americans spew into the atmosphere. Like, we are the worst in the entire world. So if anything, we owe the rest of the world to be more polite, and we should, right off the plane when we land in different countries, we should be handing out money or gifts, or I'm sorry for what we're doing to the entire, like, what is this attitude? I'm an American, you mess with the wrong American, I have the right. Like, it's just so, if it was just this, then whatever, but it represents so many bad things on a personal and national level that my country has committed. It's, and then you think about people like Charlie, anyway. Okay, well, that's that episode. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.